Japan today is an exciting place. And has Japan changed since Clarence James Gamble wrote a jinrikisha in 1908? Here's Tokyo with its energy and cutting-edge action, the newest electronics, everything automated, automated food, great engineering. The Tokyo subway burrows 5 stories underground, but other modes of transportation are available. Here, I don't know what it is. Japan today is brimming with self-expression. You can assume your own look. You can dress as you please and be happy. Outlandish, elegant in high fashion, stunning architecture by Pritzker Prize winners Shigeru Ban, Kazuyo Sejima, a woman making architecture history. But Japan maintains its traditions. Here's Hello Kitty and video games with culture, which this young person will soon be playing, perhaps one day offering perceptive social commentary like Genki Sudo's World Order. This is Japan today. In 1908, Japan looked rather different. Thatched roofs and timbered houses. Local photographers went into the countryside and then printed postcards that featured farmers at work, sumo wrestlers with their retainers, heavily tattooed men. This is Yokohama and the studio of Tie Nami, one of those postcard-making photographers. Here, the 100 steps of Yokohama, destroyed in the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923. And this customary mode of transportation, even as Japan was rapidly becoming industrialized. In 1908, the Gambles were planning their trip to Japan. The family, David Berry Gamble, Mary Huggins Gamble, Sidney David, 17 years old, and Clarence James, 14 years old in 1908, this photo taken a few years earlier. Oldest son, Cecil, was away at college. In 1908, the Gambles were living in this typical Victorian house in Avondale, just outside Cincinnati, Ohio. Winters are cold in Cincinnati, and for several years the Gambles had been spending their winters in Pasadena, in California. They could afford to do this because David's father had co-founded Procter & Gamble. From James Gamble, David inherited a legacy of character and a habit of generosity. In turn, James Gamble had received such a legacy from his father and forebears. For generations, Gambles had been vicars and ministers, while one member of the family owned a brewery. The father of James Gamble lived on this farm near Enniskillen, North Ireland, and was a Methodist minister. After emigrating to America, he held services in his home. When son James Gamble co-founded Procter & Gamble, it was clear that the firm would be built on integrity. Probably the story that best illustrates the character of James is that told of a time when he was an elder in his church. Another elder came to him and said, "If we pay the bills, I think we ought to rule." James Gamble replied, "It is enough for us to pay the bills. Let others rule." Thanks to ivory soap and upright business practices, P&G prospered mightily. And in 1886, when Ivorydale, the history-making P&G factory, was dedicated, Mary Gamble watched with trepidation as oldest son Cecil accompanied father David up onto the roof of the factory to the base of the 200-foot smokestack. Perhaps corporate life was no easier in the 19th century than it is in the 21st. David became seriously ill, and by 1894 was forced to retire. This eventually left him free to travel and free to become a philanthropist. He and Mary supported Presbyterian missionaries in Asia, working particularly to provide education for women. This commitment to service is even today carried on by the descendants of James Gamble and by Clarence James Gamble's nonprofit Pathfinder International, which supports education and independence for women. After spending several winters in a hotel, David and Mary decided to build their own home in Pasadena, and in early 1908, they signed a contract with architect brothers Charles and Henry Green, whose work was in the forefront of the arts and crafts movement. Thus, the new home of David and Mary Gamble in Pasadena, so different from the house in Avondale, is today the Gamble House of the city of Pasadena and a United States National Historic Landmark. Charles and Henry Green were often inspired by Japanese building styles. In the Gamble House, wood is celebrated. Honduran mahogany, Burma teak, Oregon pine, carefully finished to bring out the natural grain. Dowels cover metal. Exposed structural members become elements of the design. Friezes on redwood panels are based on Japanese wood carving techniques. Mary Gamble was well educated in the arts. Her mother had been a painter and artist. Mary collected internationally acclaimed rookwood pottery, whose home was in Cincinnati. Both David and Mary were open to new ideas. This was the living room of the Avondale house. This the dining room of their new home in Pasadena. The Gambles knew that they would want appointments of an Asian character for the Pasadena home. During their tour of Asia, they were in China and Korea briefly, but they were 10 weeks in Japan, studying the culture and art of Japan, visiting the many schools their philanthropy was supporting, and shopping for appointments appropriate for the Green and Green house. The book, Japan 1908, is an account of those 10 weeks of shopping and study, documented by hand-tinted photographs, 120 photographs taken by Clarence and Sidney, who were talented photographers. But those photos, when first discovered, looked like this. They seemed scarcely worth bothering with until they were scanned and the information they held emerged, and then such interesting people. People from another time, grounded in their own place and space. A beggar in 1908. A little girl, a babysitter. A working woman quite sure of who she is. Sails at full mast. A fisherman unloading his catch. The local pharmacy. This a shop for tourists and a restaurant. The early Takashimaya store. Takashimaya everywhere in Japan, just as is Macy's in the U.S. But the photos had no titles, no notes or explanations accompanying them. Happily, Clarence had been required during the Asia trip to write a daily journal, which gave us dates, an itinerary, and some mention of photos. At this point, the Japan 1908 project was discovered by Staya Hamada Novik, a Japanese person who read kanji and who became totally involved in the research. And so we know by reading the kanji on the uniforms of these jinrickshaw men that the Gambles stayed at the fine Kyoto Hotel in Kyoto in 1908. Gradually, by scrutinizing the journal of Clarence, and with the help of Staya-san and many of her countrymen, for each time she returned to Japan, she would ask if anyone recognized this site or that building. Indeed, many Japanese individuals helped to write this book. And now we can take a trip back in time. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, the Oran, the highly sophisticated courtesans, entertained the wealthiest Tokugawa government officials. In the 20th century, on April 22, 1908, actresses dressed in the distinctive costume of the Oran proceeded through the streets of Kyoto to the delight of immense crowds. In the 21st century, the Oran procession is held each year in Niigata. Here, in 1908 in Kyoto, young actresses portray girls studying to become Oran. The lead Oran is sheltered under a tall parasol held by her servant. The Kyoto procession was chronicled in the Osaka newspaper and included this line drawing of the event. On April 21st, 1908, the Fushima Inari Matsuri, a street festival, was held in Kyoto. First, the prayer tree, its prayers written on slips of paper tied to its branches, was drawn through the streets. Then the gods were carried, safe in these great red cars. The cars weighed over a ton and were jiggled and jostled enthusiastically by strong men who, for this service, were assured freedom from rheumatism in old age. Sake stands every 2 blocks may have encouraged the enthusiasm. The Kyoto Morning Sun published their photo of the festival, a photo similar to one taken by Clarence or Sidney. In Nagasaki, the Gamble saw coal being loaded by hand. Clarence describes the work. Straw baskets were filled on the barge and then were passed up the lines of men and women who stood on the scaffolding. Up and up they came, handed rapidly from one to another, until the person at the top of the line dumped the contents into the hold and dropped the empty basket back on the barge. In 2 hours and a half, they could load 20 tons of coal, sometimes passing as many as 60 baskets a minute. Their wages averaged 6 cents a day. In conclusion, it would seem as though Japan has changed greatly in a century, but I would suggest that in many ways Japan has not changed. This was the healing cow at Tenmangu Shrine. In 1908, you pat the healing cow, and then you pat your corresponding body part where you have pain to heal it. This healing cow was photographed at Tenmangu in 2012. The cow of 1908 was probably melted down for its metal during World War II. The wedded rocks at Ise, this photo from 1908, celebrate the union of Itsunagi and Itsunami. After a second wedding ceremony, Itsunami gave birth to 8 beautiful children who became the islands of Japan. Itsunagi and Itsunami then created many gods and goddesses who are the mountains and valleys, waterfalls and streams and winds of Japan. The straw rope seen in this photo taken in 2012 ties the great rocks Itsunagi and Itsunami together. The rope weighs over a ton and is renewed several times a year. In May of 1908, the carp banners were flying, just as they flew in Tsuyama in May of 2012. Today, very modern shoes remain outside the entryway of homes and public buildings. The 7 gods of luck are honored. Festivals that go back hundreds of years continue to throng the streets. Wonderful food is served with great care. The rain falls in buckets, and Japan is still Japan, the Japan of 1908. The book, Japan 1908, The Adventure of 14-year-old Clarence James Gamble, is available online at www.japan1908.com.